Hi friends, it's finally video time again. This week, a little bit late, I will be wrapping up everything that I read in January, but before then I know that all of my imaginary fans are just screaming to know, Joe, where the hell have you been? Well, I wish that was an interesting story, but it's not. It's less The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and more me, the tax deadline, and the highly questionable coping mechanisms. The short version is that I just don't deal with stress well, and you might be aware that the 31st of January is the self-assessment tax deadline in the UK. Part of my job is completing our clients' tax returns for that deadline, and for some reason this year just so many of them went right down to the wire, waiting on information. People weren't sending me stuff was being held up, and I don't deal with stress well, and I particularly don't deal with stress well when I can't control it, when I can't do the work because other things are holding me up. So I know that there's all this work there, but I can't actually make any progress on it. That just, oh my god. So eventually I hit a point, there's like a little pressure valve in my head, and it just goes off and is like, okay, well now you are capable of work, watching Netflix and ordering takeaway, and that's it. Good luck. So the things I stopped doing were like exercising, like at all, leaving the house, replying to messages, showering when it got bad, cooking, cleaning, basically doing anything that wasn't just binging K-drama every moment that I wasn't working and ordering takeaway for every meal. Now, I didn't want to do it, but for the sake of this video, I went and added up everything that I spent on Just Eat and Uber Eats in the last 2 weeks of January. Anyone want to guess? Any guesses? How much? It was about £300. It was just short of £300. So, okay, that's a thing. That's a thing that happened. Let's just move on from it. Other things that I started doing, subscribing to like 5 different language learning services because I got it into my head that I was going to learn Korean. Coming up with elaborate plans to move to Korea because this is what too much drama and not enough human contact do to you. And also just spending all my savings. I don't know what it is about me and this time of year and spending my savings, but they just go hand in hand. So, was this response proportionate to the challenge that I was facing? Absolutely not. Not at all. But sometimes it's just what I have to do to get through a difficult period. I just shut down and I did what was important. I got the returns submitted. My job is what pays my bills and it keeps the roof over my head, and it has to come first. So it is what it is. I'm not feeling guilty this time, because what I would always do is if I hit a slump like this and I spent loads of money that I shouldn't have and I let myself get down and blah blah blah, I would just feel a lot of shame and a lot of guilt about, dropping my habits and, oh, you should do better than this and so on and so forth. And you know what all that does? It just makes the slump last longer. So this time I hit the deadline, it was done, I took a couple of days off work, I sorted my life out, and we're back. We're good. I'm cooking meals again. I'm eating proper food. I haven't ordered takeaway since like the 31st of January. We're doing great. And part of that is coming back to YouTube. I did not want to drop this again. Although emotionally, I very much wanted to drop it again. The thought of coming back and trying to make a video of getting in front of the camera again was just really scary. So I took some time to ease myself into it, to plan it, think about it, to pick a nice easy video, my January wrap up to be the one to do. So we're here, we're back, and videos will continue because I am committed to doing this. With that said, let's jump into January's reading stats. So obviously January was a month where most of my reading took place in the first couple of weeks before I had my nuclear meltdown, tax-related nuclear meltdown. But I still managed to read 10 books. Some of them were quite short books, but they're still 10 books. And since December I've been listening to more audiobooks, so those could still kind of slot in when I was going to sleep and getting ready in the morning, even if I didn't have the headspace to kind of read other books later in the month. So there was no formal TBR for January. However, I did want to read mostly from my 2024 TBR, which I will link up here, my 24 books in 2024. There's more than 24 books on it, it's books and series. So I wanted to make a dent in that. And 6 of the 10 books that I read in January were from that list. So I'm calling my TBR completion 60%, 6 out of 10. I read 1,973 physical pages, and I checked my Audible stats. I spent 26 hours listening to audiobooks in January. So if we say roughly 2 minutes to read a page, that translates at another 780 pages for a total of 2,753. That's average pages per book of 275, average pages per day 89. My average star rating was 4 stars for January. That is 1 2.5 stars, 1 3 stars, 6 4 stars, and 2 5 stars. To be honest, I am maybe thinking of ditching the star ratings in my videos just because I don't know. I always want to change them. I'm never sure whether I'm hitting the right mark with them when it comes to, I rated this book 3 months ago as 4 stars, and I'm also rating this book 4 stars, and how do those books compare? Are they actually the same? Maybe I'll just start talking about how much I enjoyed them, but those are the stats for January. Okay, so not taking them in any kind of order, the first 2 I want to talk about are volumes 3 and 4 of Moriarty the Patriot, which is a manga series that was on my 2024 TBR that I wanted to continue, that I'd started in 2023. This is a kind of retelling of the Sherlock Holmes stories from the point of view of Moriarty, making him a sort of morally grey anti-hero who's trying to reform British society through crime. He doesn't like how unequal things are with the nobility who are exploiting the working class, etc. I have the first 5 of these, but I have been hesitant to read the 5th one because then that means I need to go and buy more. And manga is an expensive habit. You're talking like 7-8 quid for a book. There's 19 books in that series. Do the maths. I'm not going to try and do it on camera because I'll embarrass myself. So I read the 3rd and 4th one. I gave them both 4 stars. I think maybe I've just watched too much anime, because while I was reading this, I was thinking to myself how much harder the scenes would hit if they were animated and you had the voice actors, etc. And also I saw some people in the comments of book 3 talking about just like the violence and how it made them really uncomfortable, and I'm just like, was it that bad? I mean it's violent. Like there's children being tortured, and there's a dude getting stabbed through the throat, and like, yeah, it's violent, but I don't know if it's just me, but when I read manga, I read so quickly. There's not a lot of words. Like, it's a couple of words, you look at the picture, all right, okay, and it's the next page. So even if there is something that's really violent or really gory, it's gone like that. There's no time to be uncomfortable. And also, maybe anime's just desensitized me. All the violent, gory anime that I've watched, like manga just doesn't hit the same notes. But it's really not fair on the book to be comparing it to anime. It's a different medium. I am enjoying this series. I do look forward to watching the anime once I finish it, but I am enjoying the series. I think it's at its strongest when it's them sort of, mastermind from the shadows orchestrating this plot and pulling it off, rather than just riding in and choosing violence. There was also just one translation choice, I think it's in book 4, that it just made me giggle. Because, like, bloody tosspots is not something that you call the people responsible for killing your whole platoon. The tonal dissonance there, I was just, who made this decision? So yeah, I'm enjoying this series. I can't really, I feel like the person who read these was just a different person. I read these right after New Year. I barely remember anything. I had to rely on my Goodreads reviews, which I have not been fantastic at keeping up with those, but hey, you know, life. Like, who even was that person who read these books? I've passed through fire since then. So it kind of limits my ability to talk about them. Something else that I read just after New Year was Atomic Habits by James Clear. Now, I have spoken about this in my best books of 2023 video. I mentioned this as part of my New Year reading. I try to read this every year. I get a lot of value from this, but I don't particularly want to talk about it again so soon. So if you want to see my thoughts on this, then you can go watch that other video. That's a great chance to plug my own content. Which, while we're on the subject of plugging my own content, I'm just really impressed with how that best and worst books of 2023 actually performed. It's my best performing video since I started BookTube. It got over 200 views. Just wow. I also got a bunch of new subscribers off the back of it. At the moment of filming, I have 49 subscribers, which is just crazy to me. That's an incredibly low number in the grand scheme of things, but compared to what I had a few months ago, it's impressive. So if you would like to join those 49 other subscribers, then please feel free to subscribe and support the channel. The button is just down here. I'll give you a minute. It's okay, I'm not looking, no pressure. Just, did you do it? Yeah? Okay, sweet. My other kind of New Year self-help mindset type book was Elastic Habits by Stephen Guise. Again, I talked about that in my 24 books I want to read in 2024 video. So I've been meaning to read this one for a while, probably actually since I read Atomic Habits for the first time. I wanted to read more about habits, and I like the concept of this one with it being habits that adapt to your day and your energy levels, which I think is quite important for me because, as we've just seen, I go right off a cliff sometimes. So I think this book has a strong concept. He has a very specific system for it, which I kind of hate when self-help authors are like, here's the system and this is what you have to do, and they give you all these instructions and all these exercises, and I'm just like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Or maybe I'm just generally recalcitrant and just don't like being told what to do, but I'm like, yeah, like, give me the ideas, don't give me all the instructions. His writing style is also not quite to my taste. It's not bad, it's just like he has some recurring jokes that he keeps coming back to, and they didn't land for me the first time, so every time he comes back to them, I'm just reminded about how I didn't find them funny. He also has a whole chapter where he just plugs his own products. It's essentially just a chapter of advertising, which is kind of annoying in a way, but on the other hand, yeah, man's got to eat. Like, plug that content. I will plug my own content, why not? So yeah, I don't think the book itself is necessarily that strong. I think Atomic Habits as a book is stronger. However, I do like the concept, and I am going to be looking at trying to integrate that into my life in some way now that January's out of the way. So I will let you know how that goes. I just realised that I've been forgetting to tell you what the star rating for any of these books are, which is probably why I need to drop it, but in editing I will put them on the screen, so you will know. Another two books that I read in January, or rather that I listened to in January, were the second and third instalments in the Sherlock Holmes series, which are The Sign of Four, which is number 2, and The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is number 3. I've had the complete Sherlock Holmes collection on Audible for a while now. I got it on my free trial a while ago because it was the longest book I could find that I could get with my 1 credit. Also narrated by Stephen Fry, which is a really perfect choice for Sherlock Holmes. I also just love Stephen Fry's voice. I'll listen to anything that he narrates. But since I've been reading Moriarty the Patriot, it made me want to go back to them and finish the complete collection. I started it, I never finished it. But I am counting each individual book as a book because gotta get those numbers. So The Sign of Four, this is the second one in the series. It's also the novella in which Dr. Watson meets his wife Mary, which, shout out to Chad Dr. Watson getting his women locked down in the space of a single evening and about like 5 sentences that they exchange. Man works fast. But honestly, at a certain point, this just became quite uncomfortable to listen to. Like, if you are reading a book written by, is Conan Doyle middle class? He was a doctor. A middle class English author written at the height of the British Empire and which sets part of its story in India during the Sepoy Rebellion, there is only a matter of time before you start coming across some really just uncomfortable stuff about race. So every character that isn't white is basically portrayed as a loyal servant or a vicious animal. Tonga is repeatedly described as like grotesque, deformed, vicious, venomous, animalistic, and he doesn't even get a single line of dialogue in the whole novella. Like, at least Jonathan Small gets to tell his story, and that kind of mitigates some of his guilt. Obviously he's still done wrong, but we understand his reasons for it. Like, Tonga doesn't get that because that is a privilege that is reserved for the white criminals. So that is why this book has the lowest rating of this month at 2.5 stars, because yes, I get that the times were different, but I have enough white guilt as it is without being reminded of how superior British people thought they were in the 19th century and the early 20th, late 20th, 21st. Guys, can we just let the empire go already? Like, please, it's time. Just let it go. Moving on to The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Well, the first 2 books were novellas. This is a short story collection. These take place at various times, some when Watson is still living with Sherlock at 221B Baker Street, and some when he's married and he's living with his wife Mary. I think Holmes shines a lot more in the short stories than in the novellas. I think there's not quite enough material, there's not enough meat in them to really be stretched out to that length. But the short stories are really compact, they're snappy, they're much more dynamic because he's not trying to drag out this one small concept into a whole novella. The problem that I have with the Sherlock Holmes stories is that I find it really difficult to evaluate them on their own. Because they were so seminal in the genre of crime fiction, because they've been retold and adapted and parodied and inspired so many other works, they're so ingrained in the collective psyche and in pop culture that it's just really difficult to separate the stories themselves from all that. I've seen Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock, I've seen Robert Downey Jr.'s Sherlock, I've seen Basil the Great Mouse Detective, which is just animated mouse Sherlock, I've seen House, which is just American medical Sherlock, and so on and so forth. The cold, logical, depressive male genius is so overdone now, and I'm so kind of tired of seeing it that it impacts my ability to evaluate Sherlock, who is arguably the inception of that archetype, or at least one of its most influential early examples. I think a lot of people read these books as children, and I think if I had, before I had all this cultural experience of Sherlock Holmes, then my experience of the stories would be quite different. As it stands, I'm really just reading them for the knowledge and the experience. That's not to say that I'm not enjoying them. I think I gave this one 4 stars. Should that have been a 3.5? I'm not sure. I think I'm getting rid of the star system. But as far as I am enjoying the Sherlock Holmes stories, I think the short stories are so far much better than the novellas. So next book is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is book number 1 in the Gentleman Bastard sequence. There are 3 published books. We are waiting on book 4. I had read this one before, but I had never got around to reading the rest of the series. So since I bought the first 3, I decided to reread it before starting the next. I read it in like 2019-20, and I think this is a good example of 2 things. One, the difference between reading purely for pleasure and reading critically, and 2, the difference that a couple of years can make in your own reaction and response to a book. Because when I first read it, I gave it an instant 5 stars. I thought it was amazing, I tore through it, but on rereading, you see that I've tabbed and I've annotated it, I was a lot more critical, and I knocked a star off for that, and I'll explain why. But first, let's talk about what it does well. I think the world building is done really well. It feels really immersive, drawn into the world. It'll appeal to you if you're into traditional fantasy. There are dukes and nobility and thieves and mages and wars and history and the remains of some unknowable, powerful previous civilization not built by humans, like all your typical fantasy stuff. I also think Scotch Lynch writes really well. I enjoy his word choice, his similes, his metaphors. They're not overly literary, but they're unusual enough. They have enough texture to them. They have levels to them that you can kind of pick them apart sometimes. And I enjoy that. Obviously, I do like very literary writing, but I think it can get in the way in genre fiction, which is primarily about the plot. So I think this is a good balance. The structure as well, the book itself is broken down into further books, which is broken down into chapters, and each chapter is broken into sections. He cuts back and forward a lot between the present day where Locke and the gentleman bastards are running a grift on this nobleman, and I have to say making it needlessly complicated just so they can show off, or the author can show off how smart they are. And it comes back to bite him in the arse later, but it cuts back and forth between that and kind of the origins of Locke and the gentleman bastards and the history of him and Jean Tannen, and he uses that to kind of build tension and anticipation for the payoff. Like in the first section, we want to find out what Locke did that made the thief maker sell him to chains, which is not a spoiler because that happens on like page 1. And each time you think you're going to find out, it kind of cuts back and then it cuts forward, and it's only kind of later that you actually get that payoff. So I think he's got a lot of skill there. He's obviously going for this theatrical, educated gentleman thief vibe, where he's juxtaposing your expectations of what a thief might be like and their low status in society with dialogue that shows their wit and education and their wide vocabulary. It puts me in mind of Pirates of the Caribbean a fair bit. You know, Barbossa, I am disinclined to acquiesce to your request, that kind of thing. And the characters are always having this witty banter with each other, which I think he's successful in the vibe that he's going for. It did start to grate on me a little bit in the reread. Like, it's to the point of campiness sometimes, but I don't know if I'm being too harsh on it, if I'm because of the thing that annoyed me about it, which I'm going to get to. Okay, so full transparency, and put this down for now while I talk about something else. I was recently mildly triggered by a Reads with Rachel video. I will link that in the description. But basically she was talking about Patrick Rothfuss and the underlying misogyny of the Kingkiller Chronicle and how its female characters are written, and I'm not going to go through everything that she said in that video. As I said, I will link it if you're interested, but I think when a lot of people think of misogyny, they think of like active hatred of women, whereas misogyny can take different forms. It doesn't have to be actively hostile. So the video was partly about how poor the female characters are, but it also looked at some things that, you know, Patrick had said or written online, which kind of just gave me the bit of the ick. Especially the whole bit where he talks about going to see The Hobbit being like discovering your high school crush in a porn, and like he's really descriptive with it. I'm just like, gross, Patrick, gross. It's just unnecessary. So this presented me with a little bit of a problem because I haven't read those books in a number of years now. I think I read them around about 2017, but when I did, I absolutely loved them, and I didn't pick up on any of this. Now, just because I didn't pick up on it doesn't mean it's not there, and now that it's been pointed out to me and thinking back, I don't think she's wrong. So in true me fashion, my response was far in excess of anything that was reasonable. And I was just felt so guilty. I started beating myself up. It's like, you're a bad feminist because you didn't pick up on this, and being embarrassed that I'd said in a relatively recent video how good I thought these books were, and thinking that they were ruined, and then getting annoyed and thinking that they were ruined for me forever, which is maybe not a proportionate reaction, but it is uncomfortable when it's pointed out to you that something that you enjoy is maybe problematic. Now, does that make me a bad feminist? No, it doesn't. What it means is that stuff like that is so normalised that I didn't pick up on it. And honestly, I wasn't reading critically at that point. I was finishing my degree, I was stressed, I just wanted to escape. I was not interested in critically analysing my leisure reading. However, now that it's been pointed out to me, I do think I want to go back and read them for myself and for my own opinions. I'm not going to tell myself that I can't enjoy those books because we live in an imperfect world and misogyny is everywhere. But as I said, I want to go back, I want to read them myself. This is all kind of beside the point. It is a bit of a tangent just to explain why at this point in time I have been highly resensitized to the issue of gender and misogyny in particular in male written fantasy. And that brings me to my biggest annoyance about The Lies of Locke Lamora, and pretty much almost exclusively why I knocked the full star off. And it is the overuse and reliance on jokes and references to whores. Now, I'm sure plenty of people will tell me that I'm being too sensitive. However, it's not just the word that I object to. So these days we're even moving away from the word prostitute, because to prostitute oneself, if you look up the definition, to put oneself or one's talents to an unworthy or corrupt use for personal or financial gain. So people have now started using the words sex worker, the term sex worker, because it highlights the fact that sex work is work, just like anything else. It's just a job that we shouldn't be judging people, but primarily women, for using this to make money. There's a moral and behind that a religious background to that whole idea. I'm not going to get into that. Where you stand is going to kind of depend on whether you think that sex is something that should be sold for money. There are feminists out there who are anti-sex work. That's a whole debate, but in my opinion, the word whore is just a straight up slur. It is a word that is designed to lower and demean women and nothing else. And I'm sure some people will argue, oh, but that was the times. What times? The imaginary times in this imaginary world dreamed up by a man in which everything that happens and every use of language is a decision that he makes. He's using it to set a tone, and that is a choice. And it's possibly not even a choice that he's aware of, because misogyny is so insidious and pervasive and normalised. Okay, phone ran out of memory there. Maybe I'm in the same place, maybe I'm not, but let's continue. So it's not even just the characters that are using these words, it's the authorial narrator. So there is a difference between putting words in the mouths of your characters to characterise them and the omniscient narrator also using these words. There's so many little ways in which it's used as like little quips to bring down the other characters, or to have this witty banter like, oh yes, crying like a Sansa in an empty whorehouse. But I think the best example is when he talks about how these women came together to escape their pimps and to control their own business. To give him his due, Scott Lynch does include these moments of trying to empower women or show that, you know, masculine bias, like, oh, I would have thought that that person was a man. However, in this instance, he's referring to them as a stable of whores and a pack of whores, like they're animals. The word is used 13 times in the 2.5 pages that it takes to tell this anecdote. And in my opinion, he's undermining what he's trying to do through his use, his overuse of this word. Is he trying to be ironic with it? Maybe. I suppose I could give him the benefit of the doubt. It didn't really strike me that way. And in my opinion, it's just unnecessary and it put my back right up. So that's why he only gets 4 stars now. Hopefully, book number 2, less with the whores. Yeah. If we could just like move that word into history. I think it is strong fantasy. I did really enjoy it the first time I read it, but reading it more critically, there are little bits that niggle at me. I suppose it's not more misogynistic than anything else in our society, but I also think that's why it's important to point it out, because it is really easy for that to go under the radar if you're not paying attention because it's so normalised. It's also the reason why a lot of people will argue that it's not misogynistic because they're so used to it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's an absolutely conscious choice that he's made and he's doing it ironically and I'm just not picking up on that. However, unless Scott Lynch himself comes and tells me that, I am going to assume otherwise. If you would like to have a respectful discussion about it, then please drop me a comment. This month, I also read an ebook, which is a bit strange for me because I'm not really a fan of reading on my phone. If I'm going to read actual print words, then I like to read physical books. However, I have to admit that they are cheaper and also you don't have to wait for delivery. So this book was Understanding Austen, Key Concepts in the Six Novels by Maggie Lane. And I suppose it's more of a vocabulary guide rather than concepts, or it's a bit of a grey area, I suppose. What she does is she kind of explores and defines the abstract nouns that Jane Austen uses as adjectives when describing her characters. So things like elegance, sensibility, propriety, countenance, words that can have variable meanings depending on the context that they're used in. And these shades and levels of meaning would have been understood naturally by her contemporary audience, but they might be slightly more confusing to modern audiences who aren't as familiar with the culture of the time. So I'm a huge Jane Austen fangirl, and I also just find the Georgian/Regency period really fascinating. Part of that's probably just straight up class fetishism, but there's something about it, something about this period where we were on the cusp of modernity, where society was starting to take this shape, but we were also coming out of this older period. It was also really decadent. Yeah, there's absolute class fetishism in there. But I find it very interesting, and so anything that helps me to better understand that time period, that culture, and Jane Austen's novels is always a thumbs up from me. I found this very interesting. I gave it 5 stars. She writes for a general audience, which I very much appreciate, because having been out of academia for a while, and I've been reading the Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature very slowly because trying to get back in after a while of not reading kind of academic journals is spending a lot of time with the dictionary trying to remind myself what all these words mean. So I appreciate that it's for a general readership and I found it very interesting. I think a good example is the use of the word nice. So in Jane Austen's time, it was a synonym for fastidiousness, which is a difficult word to say. Try to say that 3 times really fast. Fastidiousness. Yeah, that's difficult. So it was a synonym for fastidiousness, but it was also starting to lose this meaning and start to become the kind of catch-all nothing compliment that it is today. Like if you say something's nice, that's basically meaningless. On a side note, I really love the German phrase "nett ist der kleine Bruder von Scheiße," which basically means nice is the little brother of shit. So if you can't think of anything better to say than it's nice, you're basically saying that it's shit. Which really highlights it's just meaningless as a compliment, like, oh, that's nice. So Jane Austen sometimes uses nice in what was the newer sense at that time, but more often she uses it in its traditional meaning, and there's a whole joke in Northanger Abbey where Henry Tilney talks about this. So it can be confusing for the modern reader if you don't understand that nice had a different meaning. So this book might not be a 5-star for everyone, but it definitely was for me, and if you are a Jane Austen stan like I am, then it's probably up your street as well. Another audiobook that I listened to in January was Florence Given's Women Don't Owe You Pretty. Now, I thought I was going to get more out of this than I did, but that's probably my fault for not really looking up what it was. So in hindsight, it's marketed as an introduction to feminism for the Instagram generation, which I think, yeah, that's what it is. Because I feel like most of what she said, I've seen all over social media for the last at least 5, possibly 10 years. You know, all that cut out people who sap your energy, setting boundaries is self-care, learn to say no, all that type of stuff. I feel like if I'd read this book 10 years ago when I was the age that she was when she wrote it, then it might have been a bit of a revelation to me. However, as things stand, it just kind of felt like stuff that I'd seen before. And I don't want to write her off for being young because, you know, young women and their opinions are categorically shit on in our society. However, I did think that it lacked a little bit of nuance. I also saw a bunch of reviews on Goodreads saying that she had plagiarised a writer of colour, Chidera Egeru, and her ideas. I've not read any of Chidera's work to be able to offer an opinion on that. I know that Florence in her book does name drop Chidera and say that at one point that this was introduced to her by Chidera Egeru, these ideas. So I suppose it's the extent to which she uses those ideas. She's obviously mentioning her, and plagiarism is taking someone's ideas and packaging them as your own without mentioning them. However, I think possibly, I'm speculating as I said, but possibly it's more the fact that, you know, historically women or writers of colour or people of colour who do something find less success with it than if a white person then does the same thing later. As I say, I'm speculating, I can't really offer an opinion on that. But as I said, I think the book lacked a bit of nuance for me. It's something I find kind of a bit difficult and uncomfortable to discuss on camera because I am very passionate about feminism, but I also have a lot of guilt and worry that I am not doing feminism correctly and that my views will be called out not just by men and misogynists but by women who are better feminists than me, who are gonna like come and tell me that I'm wrong. But when I was younger, when I was Florence's age, I was very angry, and to a certain extent I still am. And for good reason, because the patriarchy just gives you endless reasons to be angry. However, I am trying to lay some of that down now because anger and resentment, they are just exhausting. They're just absolutely exhausting, and they're not useful unless you're using them to fuel action, which I'm not. I'm just stewing in them. Then they're not actually useful. And for my own mental health and my own peace of mind, I am trying to lay that down. Also, anger does not build bridges. It does not bring people to your side. It does not convince people that you are right. You only need to look at any comment section on the internet anywhere ever to see how people coming at each other argumentatively, it does nothing. All it does is soothe the ego of the participants of the argument and entrench them more deeply in what they believe, because psychologically, if humans have an antagonist, if they have an opponent, they set themselves against that opponent and they will refuse to think that anything that person says could be right. Psychologically, actually, the best way to get someone to agree with you or to consider your arguments is to agree with them first and then introduce, oh, have you thought about this? So yes, you're right about X, I absolutely agree with you, but have you thought about Y? I think also some of my experiences in more recent years as a white person kind of trying to come to terms with and accept my own unconscious biases and internalized racism, which that's a whole conversation in itself, but it's given me a little bit more sympathy with men, just a little bit, because most white people don't realise that they're racist. They don't understand how unconscious bias works. And as I've just been talking about, a lot of men consider themselves feminists. They believe that they want equality for women, but they don't understand the really low-level, insidious misogyny that hurts women without them even realising it. It's the same when it comes to any marginalised group, particularly language. We don't even think about the language that we use a lot of the time. I also think that men don't really have a strong, empowering narrative at the moment outside of toxic masculinity. So you've got incels on the one hand who feel rejected and so reject women, and then on the other hand you've got these alpha pickup bros on YouTube telling you how you need to put women in their place. And these are both setting up women as the antagonist in the male story, whereas the antagonist for both women and men is patriarchy. Patriarchy hurts everyone. Hi friends, Editing Joe here. So I was rambling a bit here. What I was trying to say is that Florence's book feels like it's coming from a place of anger. It's a place that I was in my 20s, and basically reacting to that anger by trying to reject and remove the sources of it from your life. I didn't feel like there was anything in there about trying to build bridges, and in my experience, human relationships and life will always involve compromise. And unless women are all going to piss off to our own planet and colonize it and do it without men, which if you're organising that, hit me up, I want to come. But unless we are going to do that, I feel, at least personally, that we need men on our, maybe not all men, but we need men on our side as allies. Slavery wasn't abolished just because the slaves asked for it. You need allies. Now, obviously, both men and women have a responsibility to educate ourselves. If you do have privilege, you have a responsibility to understand that privilege and try to use it for others. However, I think it's very easy once we've done a bit of work on ourselves to start looking down on other people who haven't done that work yet, even though we know ourselves how uncomfortable it is to do that, and maybe we spent a lot of time running away from doing that work. But once we've done it, it's and then we get to feel superior. And I am absolutely talking from experience here. We are all hypocrites. I think if we can put the hand out to help women find feminism, then we should be doing the same for men. Now, to an extent, obviously, you can take a horse to water, you can't make it drink. That goes for men and women. You cannot change someone's mind by effort of will alone, but you can provide them with the information. Now, I'm also not trying to compare the male and female experience. And when I talk about an empowering narrative for men, I know that some people might find that a bit triggering, because I definitely would have a few years ago, like I'm advocating for male pride parades or something. It's absolutely not that. I know that men are already empowered under the patriarchy. The problem is they don't have the story to back that up. A lot of them do not realise the extent to which they have privilege under this system. And stories are so important. There just aren't enough strong, positive examples of healthy masculinity in the mainstream to combat against these toxic narratives that paint women as either the straight up enemy or as trying to grab more than our share because we've achieved equality already. So hopefully that just makes my point a little bit clearer. So while I think all the things that she says in this book are important, it is important to set boundaries, and it is important to cut people out of your life if they are genuinely toxic to you. However, I don't think there's enough focus on when are people genuinely toxic. Human relationships are based on compromise. You cannot have a friendship or a romantic relationship or a familial relationship without some kind of compromise at some point. You cannot constantly be prioritizing yourself as the individual. And yes, women are taught to prioritize others over themselves, which I think is why this narrative is important. I think it's about phases. I think you go through the individualistic phase when you're first introduced to feminism of, okay, I need to prioritize myself more because women traditionally are prioritizing others, but that can't be the be all and end all of it. I think there has to be evolution after that where you find a balance, because we should all be finding that balance between prioritizing ourselves and prioritizing other people. That's how we make the world a better place. Okay, so I don't know if you can tell by how red my cheeks got during that last section, but that was very difficult for me to talk about. And now moving swiftly on. The last book that I'm going to talk about in this video is The Book of Dust, Volume 1, La Belle Sauvage by Philip Pullman. This is his second trilogy set in the world of His Dark Materials. And this book is set when Lyra is just a baby, and it basically tells the story of how she came to live at Jordan College, where she lives at the beginning of Northern Lights, the Golden Compass, if you're American. If you've watched any of my videos, you'll probably know that I love the His Dark Materials trilogy. I read it when I was 12 years old. It was so very formative for me. They're still some of my favourite books of all time. I reread them regularly. I've been listening to the audiobooks recently, and I will talk about those in my next wrap-up video. So it's an interesting comparison to read the second trilogy for the first time as an adult compared to reading the first one as a child. I think His Dark Materials is stronger, or I should say Northern Lights is a much stronger first installment in a trilogy than this book. However, I did enjoy this. It's amazing to return to Lyra's world I always love Philip Pullman's writing, and there are some genuinely sinister moments, some moments that tug on your heartstrings, some moments that are quite creepy, especially with Bonneville and his demon, and also some moments that make you quite angry, like with the League of St. Alexander, which is basically this world's Hitler Youth. However, I do think criticisms that the plot is slow and doesn't really go anywhere, and that it just feels a bit like this book was written just to show how she got to Jordan College, that it doesn't really stand that strongly on its own 2 feet, that Malcolm and Alice aren't, very vibrant characters. I'll agree, Malcolm, he's a bit bland. His primary motivation is just that he loves Lyra and wants to protect her, but there's no reason for that. Like, it's just, oh, he held the baby and now he loves her because he's an only child and he's fascinated by a baby. I don't know. Like, he goes through all this stuff to protect her, and it's like, why did he do that? On the other hand, I think Bonneville is a great antagonist. However, I feel so bad for his demon. Like, it's difficult for me reading these books as an adult because I get that the demons are part of the person. They're not actually animals. They're the person's soul just outside of the body. So Bonneville's demon is part of Bonneville. However, emotionally, all I can see is it's an animal, and when they fight or they get hurt or they're in pain or they're distressed, all I can think of is, oh my god, someone protect that baby. And I was listening to the Subtle Knife audiobook while I was getting ready for work the other morning, and I forgot just, like, it's bad enough in print, but with the voice acting as well, I forgot how much the end of chapter 14 destroys me. And I'm actually about to cry thinking about it. And so here's me, like, desperately trying to not cry while putting my makeup on and getting ready for work. So I gave this a 4. I've remembered to say the rating this time. I gave this a 4. I did enjoy it. I think maybe it's because it's riding on the coattails of his Dark Materials. I do think it is weaker and doesn't stand up to Northern Lights as a first instalment. However, if you enjoy Philip Pullman, if you enjoy that world, it looks big, but the typeface is huge. It's not actually that long of a book. It's written for older children, it's an easy enough read, so if you enjoy Pullman or you enjoy that world, then it's worth going back to it. The Secret Commonwealth is book number 2. I'm going to pick that up next. Book number 3 is hopefully going to be published this year. So those were all the books that I read in January, which was a difficult month, but we got through it and life's good again. I'm hoping to get back to posting every week on a Saturday. There may be some gaps. I'm not going to be too strict with myself. I'm doing this for fun. It's a hobby. It's not a business. I do want to try and branch out and make some different types of videos. Maybe I have like a video essay planned. I have some books, I have some research material. Obviously I just never got the chance to really get into that, so I'm going to pick that up again. But if there's any kind of books or videos that you would like to see me read or make, if you would like to subscribe and stick around and support the channel, then please do, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.